The men called themselves gentlemen. They wore polished boots, spoke with soft manners, and prayed in the pews of their churches. They boasted of plantations, of wealth, of civilization. They called the land their home. But behind those walls of brick and wood, behind the carefully drawn curtains of southern mansions, they carried dirty secrets, secrets that turned the lives of black women into endless nightmares. These weren't affairs. These weren't romances. They were unspeakable acts of control, obsession, and cruelty, buried beneath the filthy mask of respectability. The air inside the great houses reeked of contradiction. A violin might play at dinner, laughter echoing in candlelight. Yet somewhere beyond the walls, faint cries would cut through the night, carried by the wind from the slave quarters. Chains clinked with every step, and in the silence, whispers of suffering hung like ghosts in the rafters. The world praised the planters as refined men of culture and virtue, but inside their private rooms, behind locked doors, they revealed a side that was disturbing, filthy, and brutal beyond words. What happens when power hides behind respectability? When a man's desires are written into law and a slave's body becomes his playground of cruelty? The answer is a history soaked in shame, a history that breaks the heart the deeper it is uncovered. From the 1600s through the 1800s, as the transatlantic slave trade reached its height, black women were dragged across oceans and thrust into a system designed to strip them of everything. On sprawling plantations of sugar, tobacco, and cotton, wealth was measured not just in crops, but in human lives. These women became both the backbone of the economy and the hidden victims of filthy obsessions. They worked the fields under a scorching sun, but when the day ended, their torment often moved indoors into the private spaces of the masters. The hypocrisy was staggering. White masters presented themselves as pillars of morality, men of faith who read scripture at dawn and dined with their families at dusk. In public, they defended purity, civilization, and order. In private, they violated every principle they preached. Black women were forced into dual roles: laborers in the fields by day, caretakers, concubines, or prey in the shadows of the night. The plantation system was not simply built on labor. It was built on bodies exploited at every level. Imagine being a young woman torn from your homeland, stripped of name and language, and forced not only to till the soil, but to serve the appetites of the very men who claimed ownership over your body. Imagine living with the knowledge that refusal meant death, resistance meant mutilation, and silence was the only shield, however fragile. This was the system's cruel genius. It left no path to dignity, no path to freedom within those walls. The system itself was designed to protect these filthy lies. Black women were defined in law as property, no different from cattle or land. That definition gave white masters absolute power, the right to use, sell, or destroy at will. Their bodies became instruments of labor, yes, but also vessels of reproduction. The masters forced pregnancies upon them, turning women into tools to increase the slave stock. Children born of these violations were not granted freedom. They were branded with the same chains, feeding the master's wealth with each generation. Silence was the currency of this system. Women who resisted, who spoke out, who dared to push back against the unspeakable acts, were whipped until their backs split open, mutilated as warnings, or killed outright. The message was clear. Compliance was survival. But survival came at a price that broke souls and fractured entire families. White society ignored what was in plain sight. Ministers and neighbors turned their heads, pretending the facade of gentility was real. They clung to the mask of purity, dismissing stories of cruelty as exaggeration, or worse, blaming enslaved women themselves. This silence was not ignorance. It was complicity. It was a deliberate decision to preserve the illusion of morality while women bled in the shadows. Yet behind this mask lurked dirty secrets that no silence could fully erase. Masters turned bedrooms, barns, and sheds into spaces of forced intimacy. They purchased young black women on markets that disguised exploitation under the term fancy trade. These women were displayed, priced not only for labor, but for beauty, for the twisted desires of men who could buy and sell their bodies as easily as a bag of sugar. Publicly, These same men condemned interracial unions as sinful. Privately, they indulged in obsessions that left scars across generations. Refusal was never an option. Compliance was survival, but it was also a living death. An endless series of humiliations where a woman's body became a battlefield for someone else's cruelty. Even wives often knew. Some white mistresses pretended not to see. Others directed their rage not at their husbands but at the enslaved women, lashing out with punishments, tearing apart families, ensuring that the trauma spread like wildfire through the quarters. These weren't affairs of the heart. They were disturbing realities woven into the very foundation of slavery. They were nasty secrets hidden beneath polished portraits and biblical sermons. They were filthy lies whispered into the ears of society, demanding silence while women endured torment in plain sight. And the impact was devastating beyond words. Black women carried psychological scars that seeped into every generation. Many could never speak of what they endured. The pain was too raw, too dangerous, too unspeakable. Families were broken apart, children born of these forced unions often taken, sold or raised as shameful reminders of their mother's exploitation. Dignity was stolen, intimacy shattered, lives reduced to survival under cruelty. Imagine having no right to say no. Imagine your very body reduced to a commodity, your soul trapped in a system that rewarded your master's obsession and punished your resistance. For enslaved women, life itself became a cruel paradox. Survival demanded silence, but silence meant carrying unspeakable truths alone. Yet history shows us that even in silence, the truth has a way of surfacing. Even silence cannot bury truth forever. The voices of enslaved women, though often forced into whispers, began to surface. In secret corners, in fragile scraps of writing, in testimonies dictated to abolitionists, the unspeakable realities emerged like ghosts refusing to rest. Slave narratives shattered the polished mask of plantation life. Women like Harriet Jacobs risked everything to put words to the torment they endured. In incidents in the life of a slave girl, she revealed the daily terror of being hunted by her master, the impossible choices between submission and survival, the agony of protecting her children while carrying the weight of unspeakable humiliation. Her testimony was not unique. It was the echo of countless lives finally breaking through silence. Letters and diaries of white men themselves sometimes betrayed the truth. Private writings exposed how they justified their obsessions, how they cloaked brutality in the language of property, or how they confessed sins only to their God while continuing in secret. In court cases, rare, but unforgettable, the scandals could no longer be hidden. Lawsuits over inheritance, disputes about paternity, whispers of mixed blood, children, all cracked open the filthy facade, revealing the disturbing undercurrent everyone already knew, but refused to say aloud. And then there were the oral histories, carried in the memories of Black families. Around firelight, in hushed voices, grandmothers passed down stories of women taken into the big house at night and returning broken at dawn. Mothers warned daughters of the dangers that lived not in the fields, but in the hallways of the master's home. These stories survived the centuries, even as official records tried to erase them. They were truths buried not in books, but in bloodlines, whispered from one generation to the next. The dirty secrets the world pretended did not exist have become undeniable. Modern science itself, through DNA testing, has exposed what plantations tried to hide. Across the United States and the Caribbean, African American families trace bloodlines that lead directly to white masters. Every genetic match is a testimony, a silent witness that confirms what women could not always speak. These children, born of violation, are history written in the very flesh of descendants today. But how did society react to these revelations? With denial, with rage, with silence. In slavery's time, white society framed enslaved women as temptresses, seductresses, even liars, placing the blame squarely on the victims. To admit the truth would have shattered the illusion of white purity, of moral superiority, of patriarchal control. So the myth was easier, the myth that Black women were immoral, while white men were innocent victims of temptation, a filthy lie to excuse unspeakable crimes. Even in the decades after emancipation, the story remained buried. Historians skirted the subject, too uncomfortable to probe into the bedrooms of the past. Academic silence became a second erasure, burying women's voices beneath the guise of respectable scholarship. Plantation museums sanitized their tours, highlighting grand architecture and the lives of masters while avoiding the disturbing realities of abuse that happened within those very walls. And yet, Black communities never forgot. Oral traditions carried the weight of memory. Churches, families, and storytellers preserved truths long before they appeared in books. The pain was not just historical, it was living. Descendants carry the heartbreak of stolen ancestry, the knowledge that their bloodline itself was shaped by cruelty. When stories resurface, they reopen wounds, forcing families to reconcile with a past where survival itself depended on silence. Today, as these stories finally come into the open, the cultural reaction is one of shock and resistance. Some recoil from the idea, unwilling to accept that so-called gentlemen were predators in their own homes. Others break down in grief, recognizing that their family histories are built on these filthy foundations. But denial cannot erase evidence. Silence cannot defeat the testimonies that have bled across centuries. Why were these men so obsessed? Why did they risk their reputations, their marriages, even their souls to carry out unspeakable acts against enslaved women? The theories are as disturbing as the acts themselves. For many, it was the raw hunger for power. Controlling a woman's body was the ultimate expression of ownership. By forcing intimacy, by stripping away dignity, masters reasserted dominance not just over one woman, but over an entire community. Their obsessions were weapons, reminders that no boundary, no right, no sacredness existed for the enslaved. Others point to fear, fear of emasculation, fear of losing authority. In public, these men claimed control, but in private, many were fragile, insecure, obsessed with proving themselves. Exploiting enslaved women became their secret theater of power, a place where their authority could never be questioned. And then there was the hypocrisy of purity culture. White society exalted the ideal of moral virtue, yet its leaders were drenched in filth behind closed doors. Ministers preached chastity while owning women they violated. Politicians defended Christian marriage while fathering children with enslaved women they refused to acknowledge. This hypocrisy was not an accident. It was the foundation of the system. The commodification of Black women made everything possible. Their bodies were seen as assets, instruments to increase wealth, pawns in a filthy economic game where intimacy was stripped of all humanity. And underlying it all was a disturbing psychological hunger for the forbidden, the very act that society condemned. The mixing of white men and Black women was fetishized, desired, pursued in shadows. The more forbidden it was, the more it fueled their obsession. So what does this reveal about slavery itself? That it was not just about chains and fields. It was about power infecting every corner of life, corrupting intimacy, poisoning families, turning bedrooms into battlegrounds. When purity becomes a mask for cruelty, when morality disguises obsession, slavery reveals its true face, not just as an economic system, but as a world built on disturbing lies. And so we return to the silence of the plantation night. A candle flickers in a dark room. A door creaks open. The sound of footsteps echoes on wooden floors. Somewhere, chains rattle faintly in the distance, a woman's cry muffled against the walls. These were not rare moments. They were the heartbeat of a system that thrived on unspeakable secrets. The dirty secrets of white masters weren't accidents of history. They weren't rare scandals whispered in shame. They were part of the structure, embedded in the laws, protected by silence, excused by society. They shattered lives, broke families, and left scars that still pulse through the present. These truths break your heart not because they were rare, but because they were common, because they were hidden behind filthy lies that pretended purity could coexist with cruelty. Because they remind us that history's darkest chapters are often those society fights hardest to forget. The past may try to hide its filthy lies, but the truth always bleeds through the cracks of history. And when those cracks widen, when the voices of women once silenced finally echo into the present, the question becomes haunting. Will we have the courage to listen? Or will we, like the masters before us, choose silence?